So a central theme of life together as we form these groups and we begin to ask the question, how are you, where are you, is in the realm of feelings and emotions. And this is an aspect of life, I think, especially for guys, that like we really struggle to articulate. How are we feeling? What language do we have to describe that? Mm-hmm. And I've just found in my own journey, like it's very limited, and I found that to be really true for most people. And so something I want us to orient to is we're leading groups and inviting people in to answering a question. How are you? Where are you? What's going on in your life? Is this idea that our default mode is going to be to respond to the way people are answering that question by trying to solve their problems for them. So, if the three of us are in a group and, Ron shares that he's struggling in his parenting and, and I'm 10 years ahead in the parenting journey, a very easy default mode for me to go in is to go, well, Ron, let me tell you how this works as a dad. Let me just give you some quick solutions to fix that. But we don't want to do that. And here's the main reason why, because a core principle of this work in Iron Collective is this concept that people are not primarily problems to be solved. Instead, people are holy mysteries to be uncovered. And as a leader of a group, your job is to lean into the mystery, not to solve the problem. And that sounds really simple and basic, and it's so hard, even for me to do, because it's just the way we're used to showing up, and it's the way we get rewarded, right? Like we get rewarded for solving problems. But if we begin to orient to the idea that people are a mystery, then what that allows us to do is extend much more grace to people. Because we can hold the totality of a person, who they are, what they do, what they failed to do, and all the various ways that they show up in relationship in life can be contained in it, in this idea of a mystery.
One thing I like about that, we said it on a different episode, is it creates that safe space to then do more of that. And you, I think you said it in a helpful way, Gabe, that if you jump right into problem solving, or maybe even worse, silence, it creates this gap for shame to get in, which just kind of shuts us down from being more vulnerable. And I don't know, even that framing helped me to realize why this is so important.
Well, it also, I think when you solve someone else's problem or give advice, it scratches your own identity itch of like, I'm worth something. I have something to offer. I have something to give, instead of sitting in, hey, my identity is firmly rooted in Jesus. I don't actually need to solve this person's issues with my own experience or wisdom, no matter how great it is. I want to let the power of the Spirit actually uncover this mystery, and I want to ask questions and be curious and help this person actually, reach that conclusion on their own.
That's such a great point.
That's a really good insight, Ron. That makes me think of just the concept that so often we show up as consumers in relationships, and that we actually, and this is kind of like harsh language, but we consume people. Like we use people. And that, what you just named is a way that we subtly show up as a leader of a spiritual group, and we're using the people in our own group to meet our own need.
Yeah. Even as you say that, it hurts a little in a good way. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, I do that. It's helpful to notice that subtle shift.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, just as a potential pitfall for these leaders who are stepping in to lead these groups and are probably in the middle of that right now? What are some ways that you have seen that play out?
Yeah, I think a core question is you're considering leading anything, really. And this applies, of course, to this group, but it applies to like leading your family, or, even leading at work, is because people are people. And this is a relational dynamic, is that we're made for human connection. We're made for deep relationship, and we sabotage our best efforts at relationship when we use and consume, because we put ourselves at the center of the story instead of showing up in service to other people. And so I think a core question to ask as we move into any leadership role is like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I saying yes to this? What is it that this is giving me? And if it's I'm coming with need, that I'm leading and I'm doing that out of a need that I have to be recognized or to be important or whatever. This is when we actually undo the work that we're trying to do in these groups.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there a place for that more problem solving or giving advice?
I think there definitely is. There's space and all. There's all kinds of places in life, and I think it has to do with clarity of relationships, right? And I'm a big fan of the concept that clarity is kindness, and that really when we enter into relationships, we're making contracts, like maybe not written contracts, but they're contracts, they're agreements about like how we're going to interact with one another. And so certainly there's human relationships where it's appropriate to have a contract of that's more transactional. That's and that's I think if you're going to see a therapist, I'm showing up. I'm planning to use my therapist's wisdom and knowledge to give me. If I show up to the doctor, I'm planning to use that relationship to give me something. But I think like when we enter into these spaces of spiritual community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer has a great line in his work, Life Together. He says, he who loves community destroys community.
Mm-hmm.
He who loves people builds community. And so oftentimes what happens with especially spiritual leadership is we show up trying to, with a concept that's bigger than humanity, bigger than relationship. It's some dream that we have to build a program or to have some sort of like outward success. But we're going to use people and relationships to make that happen. And when we do that, what Bonhoeffer is saying is we destroy the relationships that we're trying to build. But if we just focus on loving people, then what happens is we build great ministry. We build great community. I think we see that in the church all the time.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about consuming people, what's a way that you can kind of circumvent that? I know part of it's really knowing yourself, and knowing your own tendencies. So is there a way that a leader or a participant can actually avoid this consumer mentality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the best ways, and I think you hit on this in your question a little bit, is self-awareness. And it's being aware of my own heart as a leader, as I prepare to lead, where am I? And so, we talked about inviting others into answering this question, like, hey, how are you doing? But as the leader of a group like this, you actually need to do that work before the group, so for me, my practice would be, at some point in the day before, if I'm going to lead a group at 10 o'clock in the morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to sit with my journal and I'm going to ask myself the question, like, hey, how am I right now? And the first way that we want to answer that question is in the realm of feelings. And we're going to talk about why that is. Now, our default way of answering that question is going to be talk about our to-do list, all the things that we're going to do. That's mostly it.
Yeah.
Or the thoughts that we have. Our go-to, especially as guys, is not going to be feelings, but we really want to encourage groups to answer the question, how are you, primarily in the context of feelings. And so I want to talk about first this idea of emotional intelligence, which has really become popular in especially business leadership and psychology, and for good reason. So the science of emotional intelligence says that unlike IQ, which is basically fixed, like you're born with a potential of a certain processing speed in terms of your thinking ability. EQ is not fixed in the same way. EQ, and there's lots of science to back this up, is a set of skills and an orientation to relationships that you can grow in. And the reason is because EQ and feelings is actually a physiological thing that's happening. And so when we talk about feelings, this isn't an ethereal pie in the sky kind of thing. First, we need to talk about the body. And so the way that as a human you experience life and the world is your nervous system. And so, you feel your way through life, and literally the way your body works is all those nerves feel and sense and hear and see, and all those transmissions of your nervous system go up through your spinal column, go into your brain. And the first place they go is to the place where you feel. and that part of the brain that you feel before it goes secondarily to the place where you process your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know if you know this, but do you know where, at least in our modern American culture, like we started kind of flipping the focus
In terms of
like
feeling and thinking, or
yeah, I'm just wondering if there are certain I can think of certain events in our like modern history that maybe started flipping that to where it is almost ironic to me that the word feelings is thrown around as a joke almost. Like,
Yeah.
oh, share your feelings. Oh, that's fluffy. And it's like, but biologically, we literally
Yes.
are feeling based.
Yes.
I actually heard a speaker once talk about, they argued that every decision, 100% of decisions are emotion-based decisions. And that's debated a little bit, but I think it's correct as well. And yet there's almost still this stigma, at least for guys, around feelings. Where did that come from? I don't know. I'm just curious.
Well, I think it goes, I mean, I'm not a social scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it makes sense that it goes way back. And I think sometimes like we don't take into account the breadth of human history, that like events happened hundreds of years ago that are still shaping our culture and our life. And so if you really look at like the Enlightenment, and rationalism, like that is the those are the philosophical and cultural systems that really shaped Western culture for the most part, and is really based on an idea that you could figure the world out through thinking, through rationality. And so that, our entire education system is built on that premise. And so just it undergirds so much of the way that like we're oriented to the world. You could say our worldview. And so even if you haven't thought about that, I think that's true. I also think in at least American culture, feelings are associated as a feminine sort of aspect of what it means to be human, and instead of just a human aspect.
It's almost odd. Yeah,
that men somehow don't feel, or shouldn't feel. It's definitely out there.
Well, and part of it is, I think in some households it is viewed as weakness, because it's often tied to, the physical like manifestation of emotion, crying or anger or whatever. And you're always being told to suppress those as kids. Stop crying, or don't throw a tantrum, or don't do this or that. And I think that results in us stuffing those down as we get older, in adolescence and then adulthood. And it's just like the continuation of that. And as you talked about in an earlier episode, I mean, oftentimes you're rewarded for that in culture and society and the workplace, for like, hey, you don't have you can work your way through this logically and without emotion. You set that to the side, or you check it at the door, and you came into work and did your job and left. Like, good for you. We'll promote you. You know?
Yeah, you can handle your business without drama or something like that.
Yeah. Ever since our Iron Collective group, I've been noticing myself in parenting do that. And it is such a norm. I've noticed others do it too. But I'll tell my daughter, like, stop feeling in any given situation. Like, don't do that. Don't get upset. And now I kind of stop and think to myself, like, wait, why am I saying that? I don't even know. And I don't know where the line is, what's helpful or not. But I have noticed that is very much a norm in our culture, to kind of stop a kid from feeling. I don't know why. Maybe that's easier for us as parents, but of course that then has a long-term repercussions.
Yeah, so I think we want to undo that narrative, and that's really like when we're talking about discipleship, like when we're talking about learning to follow Jesus. I think like one of the most important things we can impart to people is a different worldview. Is to say, like, one, we have to identify by worldview, I mean, the lenses through which we see life, right? And that's those are sets of beliefs and values and all kinds of things. And oftentimes it's subconscious. It's not something we've really processed, but it's important to process it and say, like, really, this is my worldview. But then to challenge that worldview and say, but what is a biblical worldview? And that goes back to this idea of story. And this is why God's story is so important, is that the more we understand God's story, that he has a true narrative of the world that's meant to shape our worldview, that's meant to give us the proper lens to look through the world. And so when it comes to feelings, like God's story actually has a tremendous amount to say about that. And I think that, that's an important thing as leaders to understand that in God's story, the Hebrew understanding of humanity was this idea of the heart, basically.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's worth voicing because a lot of people, I think, share parts of my story. But now, with the lens I have now, I can see that I've been very engaged in a very positive way in the life of church and faith since I was very little. But it was always primarily with the lens of having the right beliefs and then like doing the right things. Mm-hmm. And feelings or emotion had no place in it. And it's an odd thing for me to even say out loud. That's why I'm kind of pausing as I say it, because it's like, no one said that was bad. No one said that doesn't fit here. It just wasn't ever talked about. Yeah. It wasn't done. It wasn't modeled or anything. So that had nothing to do with a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And I'm starting to see it in fresh new ways now, but that's been almost like thrown me off in this process, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, at the core of human brokenness is brokenness in relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And that goes all the way back to Genesis 3, that goes all the way back to the garden. And then we have particular brokenness in relationships in our culture. And I think in our culture, it's our central value is really efficiency. And, emotion's not efficient.
It's not. Yeah, I know. Well,
quite the opposite.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's why we get frustrated with our families, because it's like, hey, I'm trying to make something happen. I'm trying to get us on vacation. I'm trying to get dinner on the table. Yeah. I'm trying to get you to bed.
And time is of the essence.
And you're feeling, I don't have time for that.
Yeah.
Right?
And we laugh, but that's probably at the core of it a lot of times. Yeah.
But the problem is it sabotages what we really want, which is what we most deeply desire is connection, relationship, to be loved and to have capacity to love others. And so that's why I think like this is such an important skill set that we're passing along, in these groups is to say like, you have to grow in your capacity to feel emotion yourself, to be able to accurately have language to describe that part of your experience, of your journey each day, of like how am I experiencing that, not in my thoughts, not in my actions, but in my emotion and feelings.
Well, can we talk about the feelings wheel now?
We can, but I want to talk about the Hebrew understanding first, just to give real quick, because zoom out of modern Western culture where we've acknowledged we don't have a good framework for feelings. In the Hebrew text, the ancient Hebrew understanding of the word the heart wasn't talking about the thing that pumps blood through your body, but was talking about essentially the air traffic control center of you as a human being. It's the most central part of you, where it's basically the sum total of your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, your deep desires, and your volition, like your ability to decide. And so in the scriptures, when the word heart is mentioned, it's not talking about feelings in the same, because that's the way we think of it. It's like, it's love, it's feelings. It is that, but it's much more than that. And it's, and for the Hebrews, they don't separate out feelings and thoughts and desires. All that's wrapped up together, which is accurate, right? Like we cannot bifurcate people. Like all those things are intertwined. But the reason we're starting with feelings is because out of all those things in the Hebrew understanding of the heart, the emotions, the feelings are the part that we just struggle to name.
Yeah.
And so we're going to start there. And that takes us to the feelings chart.
Wheel.
Feelings wheel.
Right.
Yeah.
Although it may have different forms other than the wheel, correct?
Feelings chart, potentially.
Chart.
Maybe the heart chart.
Yes. A heart
Do you
chart.
want to try to describe it, Ron?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, to tee that conversation up, this was like learning a new language for me,
Same.
And it may be for some of the guys who are listening here, because, as I think about feelings, it was just what you said, Gabe. It was like, oh man, I know the feeling of love, and that's it.
Yeah.
and I could like name that maybe.
I know the feeling of eating food.
But,
I don't know
yeah,
about you.
I
Like,
mean,
that's a feeling.
there weren't a whole lot of feelings,
Yeah.
words in my vocabulary, and certainly not if someone were to ask me on the spot, "What are you feeling right now?" I would quickly go to thoughts. I would quickly go maybe even to desires, but feelings would not even be in the conversation. So, I mean, for me, as I looked at the wheel or the chart, to look at those core emotions, and then trace it out to these secondary and tertiary words and begin to even see how those are interrelated was a big deal, and actually helped me have language. And as I journaled things, in preparation for group or during group, it's like, oh man, this is actually what I'm feeling, and it's tied to this, situation at work or at home or in parenting. But, for a long time, I didn't even have that.
How did it run? Because it was fun watching you journey and awaken to your emotions and being able to have lots of language to describe that. And I saw so much growth in you in these last years in that. Talk to us about like how did that affect some of your core relationships as you began to understand how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a house that we never talked about feelings. And so for me, that was, like I said, brand new. I'll say for the parenting one, that was a big one for me because I have a kid who feels a lot. And so myself and my wife are not big feelers in the sense that we both grew up in similar households, like that didn't talk about it. But our son is. And so we had just a hard time connecting with him oftentimes and found like, man, this is frustrating. He's frustrated. We're frustrated. We aren't speaking the same language. And, he would act out like whether it was crying or whatever. And that was kind of his go-to in frustrating moments or sad moments. But what I found myself doing kind of in and after Iron Collective was encouraging him, hey, what are some feelings words? Like, yes, you can do, you can show your emotions in various ways. We can quickly go to that. I think even as guys, and anger is like probably a pretty easy emotion for guys to know. And, some guys will get mad and punch something or get angry and, lash out in some way. But, for our son, I mean, it was all about like, how do you talk about this? What words can you use to describe this? And sometimes we would even give him words like you're feeling sad or you're feeling frustrated, and help him name that. And that's been a goal of ours as a family for a couple of years now of just going, hey, we want to name this in one another. And so that we see you, he knows that we see him. And it's been a huge growth for me, but I think also for him as he grows up in hopefully a home that's not saying, don't do that and push that aside, but it's just saying, no, just give it language and let's talk about it. It's not wrong, but there are healthy ways to go about it.
Yeah, and what a gift that is that you and Lindsay give him that, and he grows up with language and a dad who sees him.
Yeah. Well, and I think for these guys in this group, just as you use this tool of the chart and the wheel, I mean, it's such a great tool in your homes. And if you're married or, have kids, I mean, just naming some of the feelings in conversation, even with your spouse, especially if she's a feeler, will like blow her away. Like I've never heard you talk about that before. Never heard you name a feeling in your own story, but man, what a great gift to your wife to say like, hey, this is actually what I'm feeling right now, that she can probably relate to,
I think it might be worth saying this. There are different ways to use the emotions chart in a group. But Gabe, one thing you did with us that I found really helpful, because similar to you, Ron, it was very new to me using these words, but more than using them, like actually noticing the emotions, was you gave us very specific instructions. And I know from my own work, it's helpful when you're new to something, like get really, really specific. And you said, actually bring 3 words each time. And so I would kind of block off a few minutes before our group and I'd pull out for me, it was a emotions wheel chart. And I would look and I would identify the core, the most basic emotion. category, and then I go out and out to the furthest and try to pick 3 words of what I was feeling that day. And then in the group, we would kind of each take turns just sharing the 3 words and why we were feeling those, and then doing the listening and stuff that we talked about earlier. I found that so helpful because it was so simple, like so specific and simple, so elementary. It was like, all right, I'm just like focusing on my form, doing a few reps until I like feel good. And what I also noticed is how often I had opposing emotions at the same time. And we would often all comment on that. I think for those listening, like you'll probably experience the same thing where you realize like, oh, I have a happy emotion and a sad one at the same time.
That's right.
Which again, helpful to be human and notice that, because again, I think in our culture, it's like, well, which are you? Happy or sad? Like both. I'm experiencing a bunch of things right now. And that was almost like a surprise to me, I think.
Well, it goes back to that concept that people are mysteries, you know? So how is it that I can be angry and optimistic and curious all at the same time? It's like, I don't know. I can't like rationally explain that to you, but I just can tell you that it's for me, that's real.
Yeah.
You know?
What about the guy? I mean, I'm listening. I'm thinking maybe someone's listening to this and they are pretty, this isn't as new and fresh to them. Like how could they show up in the group with the sharing the emotions?
Well, I think it's just modeling, right? Like we model the way for others. That's the first thing, is that no matter how, you know, how familiar you are with this kind of work, maybe you've done story work for years and years and years, but you still have to show up every day that you show up to a group. You have to choose to be vulnerable, choose to be real, choose to be authentic. Like, I'm going to actually share, because we all know like there's levels of honesty, right? Like, am I gonna choose to share how I'm really doing, or am I gonna share like some smaller version of it? And we rightly choose that based on, you know, the safety that's afforded us in different contexts. But our hope is that these kind of groups are like the ultimate safe place where everything's confidential or whatever. So I think if you're really experienced in these things, then just show up, like go first and show up real. And remember that all of us are a work in progress. Like you never like graduate from this work. It's always hard.
Yeah.
We're always going to be, you know, drawn back into hiding.
Yeah. What would you say to the person, and I'm giving like a spectrum here, because I think you can be anywhere along this, but there's people who are a lot, their default is to be more reserved and to share less and then there's actually people, I'm one of them, whose like default is to share too much, to open up too quickly. So like for anyone, and what would you say to those people in this space? Because the ideal is it's like a perfectly safe space, but it might not be too. Like, what would you say to those extremes?
Well, I think we grow, right? In these spaces, we grow as individuals, but we grow as a group as well. So the safety isn't there 100% just because we form a group like this and like, this is safe, everybody. No, like it's trust, and trust is earned, and it's earned over time with consistent behavior. And so I think like as we consistently show up in a way that says, this is a place that you can be heard. This is a place where what you share is confidential. There's a space where people will listen and respond appropriately. Then you'll build trust every single time. I think it's for all of us, no matter how much our default is to overshare, undershare, whatever. I think we need to all grow in our capacity to see each other in the groups and pay attention. And so it's not just incumbent upon the leader to pay attention to the group. It's every member paying attention to one another. And so if you're a person that's like, it's really easy to share, I like to talk a lot, then maybe for you, you want to pay attention to make sure you're not over talking and stealing space from somebody else that doesn't share as much. If you're a person who it's tougher for you to share, maybe you want to challenge yourself to share a little more than you're comfortable with. And, I know we're talking to leaders on this series. This is a big leader task. And Ron, you probably have some things to say on this because you have so much experience just leading groups in general. But yeah, I mean, I'll throw it to you. Like, how would you like what advice would you give to leaders on modulating people talking too much and not talking enough?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, you hit on it earlier where you talked about emotional intelligence and encouraging people to know themselves and their own tendencies. Like you named yours, I have a tendency to share more, and mine is probably to share less. And so just knowing that, but knowing that the group is only as good as the sum of its parts, and that, you're not there just for you. You're there for the other guys in the group as well. So
That's good.
For those who show up and maybe share too much, the encouragement to, hey, take less time and let other guys, who wouldn't share. And for those who wouldn't say enough, just the encouragement of, we need you. We need to hear from you. We need to hear from all the voices here in this group to make it as good as it can be. And you may be going through something that this guy over here is also going through, but he doesn't want to share it until you share it first, right. And model the way. And that vulnerability is contagious. And I think that's so key, in groups like this with men especially, that the leader goes first and models it. And then the other guys are always, aware of their own tendencies and showing up in a way that this group's not about me. It's not affirming my identity as a great group participant or whatever. But it's about the other guys here.
So good.